Hello.
Long time no see for Briar's book club.
I swear we said this last time as well.
Oh, it's going to be every time, I bet. Yeah, so
We
elephant in the room. Yeah,
yeah.
probably no one's going to be coming to this chat live because we've been so topsy-turvy with when it's happening and if it's happening and all that. But we promise it's because we want to do a good job. Because if we'd done it any earlier, it would have had to been rushed and it would have been stressful. And especially with the kind of book that this is, you don't want to be doing a chat unless you actually feel like you've got some sort of handle on it because it's such a strange one.
Yeah, and it's been super busy for both of us this past few months. We kept trying to, we've pushed it back multiple times. Yeah, but we're happy to be back.
We're happy to be back, and here it is. And we actually have matching copies this time, so it's very aesthetically pleasing when we, hello.
Yeah,
So,
I can't figure it out on my video.
Oh, you're trying to do that too?
Yeah.
It's me. No. So yeah, very exciting. Do let us know if you've actually read Hangsaman. But again, since we've been so terrible with letting people know and updating people with what's going on and the dates and everything, fully fine if you've just rocked up and not read it yet. That is a-okay. So, right, synopsis time. Are we good to go?
Yeah.
So it's actually quite a funny one because when you read the back, which I will in a second, it sort of, I think, gives a little bit of a different synopsis to what I actually thought it was. So I'll just read it and then I'll bloody explain myself when I sort of just talking nonsense. Anyway, so Natalie Waite, daughter of a mediocre writer and a neurotic housewife, is increasingly unsure of her place in the world. In the midst of adolescence, she senses a creeping darkness in her life, which will spread among nightmarish parties, poisonous college cliques, and the manipulations of the intellectual men who surround her, as her identity gradually crumbles. Inspired by the unsolved disappearance of a female college student near Shirley Jackson's home, Hangsaman is a story of lurking disquiet and haunting disorientation. Yeah, I said that right. So I think from that description, I personally thought that this book would track the disappearance and that you would be reading a story of a young girl who goes missing because it says it's inspired by a girl who went missing, near Shirley Jackson's home. But that's really not what we get. It's more of a sort of internal look at what could have been going on in the head of that girl who went missing. So I think maybe Shirley Jackson was very struck by this figure of this girl and was like, what was her life like before then? And so it sort of tells the story of what could have happened in the preceding months before this girl went missing. I think does that make sense?
Yeah, it's difficult because also although they always label it as inspired by an unsolved disappearance, I was reading a recent biography on her, and they're I've forgotten the name of the person who wrote it. It was done in 2016 or something, but she's through her research, she found that there wasn't concrete evidence to say that it was actually inspired by this disappearance. So it's I think, but obviously it's always advertised as that, and I think because which is, I guess, the first question that we wanted to talk about was how we came to this book and choosing it as one of our book club books, and it was from both watching and loving the film Shirley, and I feel like through watching that film we had a perhaps wrong idea of what it would be like, because the film's a very kind of fictional take on when Shirley Jackson wrote Hangsaman. It's quite a strange film to wrap your head around, because it is kind of, you know, obviously she's a real figure, Shirley Jackson, but it's not kind of portraying the life that it would have been when she was actually writing that book.
Yeah. And I think, you know, any film about a real figure prompts you to think about like biopics, and it's not a biopic at all, because that sort of
No.
insinuates that you're following birth to death, and it's just this very small section in her life when she was writing Hangsaman, and got sort of very obsessed with it. And I think in the Q&A with the director post the film, because we saw it at the festival online in 2020, and the director Josephine Decker said that they didn't want to make a biopic. They wanted to sort of create the eerie, atmospheric feeling of what it feels like to read Shirley Jackson's novels, but then the central figure is, instead of one of her characters, it's Shirley herself. I think they definitely did that.
Yeah.
Having now read Hangsaman, and it is just very alienating, just the tone of it, because she is really concerned for this missing girl, and her husband really sort of dismisses it. He doesn't understand. He thinks that this girl must
Yes.
be, you know,
Also,
just some sort of silly, naive young girl, and Shirley's just really deeply, deeply affected by it, which obviously, you know, that comes through in Hangsaman, that, you know, this deep empathy for who this girl could have been.
Yeah. No, it's a really interesting film, and I was going to say, you know, about her husband kind of dismissing her writing it. It's there's a kind of a lot of talk of like, oh, why are you writing this kind of genre fiction book, that he kind of saw it as turning into some kind of horror or kind of crime, which was obviously from the literary, you know, society looked down upon.
Yeah, and I think because she just had success, well, in the film, I don't know how accurate the timeline of the film is, but in the film, she just had success of publishing The Lottery in The New Yorker, and that was like, you know, really catapulted her. And I think her husband thought that her energies were best placed writing a sort of literary follow-up to that, and no one would want to read a story about a missing girl. It was a bit too pulpy. And what's interesting actually is that if you look at alternate covers of Hangsaman and the mass market paperback editions, it was marketed as like a pulpy horror novel, which it really isn't in a way. Like one of the alternate covers has like this girl like running away like in the mist, and it's really not that dramatic. Well, there's quite a lot in the book that you're like, well, what do we actually know actually happens? It's not what I would call an action-packed horror tale at all.
No, it's very slow pace.
Yeah, for sure. And I think honestly, like, we, you know, said in our little like question prompt there that it's definitely one of her lesser known works, but I think it's one that was really good. I mean, for us especially to start with, because the protagonist is 17 when you begin the novel, and it is, you know, coming of age has always been a genre that works well for us, and merging that with horror, I think, or not even horror, like, I don't know, gothic, or it just works because it's that time in your life where things feel really out of place, and you're really uncomfortable for a long period of time, and you have no guarantee of if or when that will end. And so I think this was a really good one personally for me, and probably you as well, to start with, because I know, I mean, her more known ones are definitely Hill House and We Have Always Lived in the Castle, and I'm sure academics or whatever literary people would always say start with that one, but I think I'm very glad that we didn't.
Yes, and also, we were gonna say how like we thought, like, from our kind of, I feel like in a way, like, having read this book, I feel like I understand the film Shirley even more.
Yeah,
because I feel like it what it kind of does with these kind of figures that you're not quite sure are real or not, and there's kind of lots of doubles of different characters, and that definitely happens in the film.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like in the film, it's her writing the novel, and at that time in her real life, she would have had kids, and you know, in the film, it's kind of it's kind of almost like suggested that she can't have kids.
Yeah.
Um,
And also there's very much like a sapphic suggestion to the film.
yeah, and they
Yeah.
take in this couple, which is, you know, the husband is kind of shadowing
Shirley's husband.
Shirley's husband at work, and you know, he works as a professor, and the wife of this couple is kind of made to be their kind of housekeeper kind of,
Mm.
and she's pregnant with a child, and I kind of felt like when watching it, I kind of felt like, is Shirley's character and this, you know, I've forgotten the character's name in the film, but the one that Odessa Young
Yeah.
portrays, I kind of felt, are they both supposed to be Shirley?
Yeah.
And and I feel like it's very much relevant to this novel. There's figures that are kind of possibly two sides of one person rather than two people.
Mhm. Or like just
Yeah,
shades of other people,
yeah,
absolutely. And that just sort of adds to just the general eeriness, isn't it? Like it's like
yeah,
it's almost, yeah, you're reading it and you don't know what it is about it that's creeping you out, because it can just be a very mundane description of a family having breakfast, Natalie's family having
yeah,
breakfast, but you're just on edge for some reason. And I think it is little, very subtle things like that, like characters that sort of crop up and are reminiscent of other characters, and
yeah.
they seem there
It's
just to
it
sort of
kind of
serve mentally, yeah, rather than
it
be an actual
yeah.
character.
It kind of also like reminded me of like because the kind of parents come up again as
Mhm.
this kind of you know, professor and his wife at the university. They're kind of doubles of her parents, and it really reminded me of like which I think they do in like the Peter Pan book as well, but very much in the film. It's like, you know, there's the two parents, you know, Wendy's parents, and they're
Mhm.
kind of voiced. Captain Hook is voiced by the same person as the father, and it's kind of,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, well, also in Hook as well, like, doesn't Robin Williams
Yeah.
play Hook and the dad as well? Or am I making that up?
I'm not, I've not seen it in ages, so
Yeah,
that
I
could
think he
well be true.
does. Yeah, but there is a weird implication there because isn't it
Yeah.
like his jo yeah, let's not get into
Yeah.
it. I've not seen it recently enough to, like, say definitively, but I thought maybe that's how they did it, which yeah.
Yeah.
Um, but also
I
Sylvie's
think it
here.
is quite Freudian.
Yeah. Well, no, this can get a bit
It's,
Freudian as well, as
yeah.
we'll get into, but yeah, Sylvie is here
Yay.
and ready to discuss. Very exciting. Um, so yeah, ready for the next slide. I feel like a university professor every time I do this. Very appropriate for this book specifically. Um, so our next sort of discussion point, feel free to answer in the chat if you've read it, or even if you haven't, take a guess. And that is, what did you think of Natalie's unconventional relationship with the members of her family? And I think we have a lot to say about this one, specifically her father.
Yeah, it's really interesting because in the kind of relationship with her father, it seems to be a lot about putting down the mother,
Hmm.
and Natalie refusing or not wanting to identify with the kind of mother figure. Um, and I thought that there's a bit where um, you know, Natalie's kind of interest is in writing, and her father's a writer, and he kind of, she has these notebooks, you know, and he kind of looks at them once a week and kind of critiques them, and they kind of talk about her work, and it's kind of this strange situation because she kind of has no privacy, and also it's like everything is kind of to be criticized by her father and fall in line with what he thinks is right. And there's this really interesting bit where they kind of both kind of are kind of judging the mother.
Yeah. Well, they make fun of that little saying that she has, the
Oh,
God saying. Yeah.
yeah, and that I was going to read out. There's this bit where I think she'd written a kind of story about the mother. And the father chuckles and says, "I hope she never sees it," he said, looked up at Natalie with a smile like a child's. And then Natalie says she's never interested in my notebooks. And then her father says, "I know, nor is she interested in my articles." And there's a kind of putting down of like she's not clever enough to engage with, and kind of judging her for not engaging and having the kind of same mind as them, and I guess them kind of having this kind of inside joke between them kind of tells us that Natalie kind of wants her father's approval.
Yeah. And I think, there's a suggestion that, Natalie thinks that she's destined for something more than being a housewife. We open the novel with a really compelling, I mean, I loved it so much. And, but this sequence where Natalie is having breakfast with her family and it's just the most trivial thing. And then suddenly you get this piece of dialogue that's like the detective asks, where were you when the murder took place? And you're like, what the fuck? Like, what is happening? And then you realize that as this breakfast is happening, Natalie is like fantasizing in her head as if she's some part of like this Agatha Christie subplot or something. She's like imagining herself being interrogated or implicated in a crime as this mysterious young woman. What did she see? What has she done? And it's just really quite funny because this happens all the time, like on a much more like less intellectual level. But
the villain.
I would always daydream about like, being in stories as my favorite actors or like members of the boy bands that I was in. I would, make these elaborate stories while I was listening to my iPod on the bus. And it's just such a teenage thing. And she really like to have this sort of grandiose sense of who you're going to be because everything's possible, right? Like at that age. And she really thinks that she's destined for something much more than what she's seen her mother do. And it sort of goes all throughout the novel, and when she fantasizes about what her life is going to be, it's always very grand and it's always very lavish, and she pictures sort of the best for herself, and almost in like a narcissistic way, but it's not narcissism because she is deeply insecure about a lot of things, and not someone that you would classify as a confident person, but within the sort of confines of her daydreams, she allows herself that pleasure, I guess, to paint this lifestyle.
I guess it's the only time in her life where she's not being judged, and it's the only secret. She can't write secrets down on paper. She can't, she doesn't even have her own stories to herself. They're being judged by her father. So she has no escape other than this kind of alternate reality in her head.
Yeah. I mean, that's why I think, it can be a whole separate question, the whole bit about the scene at the party, but where she is so desperate to be seen as grown up. And she's sort of trying to mingle with people and she's trying to say things that sound interesting. But then, what sort of happens is when people do start to treat her like a grown up, she retreats from that and she's very scared of that. And so it's this very strange dichotomy of wanting to be perceived as much older and more learned and more interesting than she is, but the second that someone sees her as not a child, that's suddenly terrifying, and she doesn't want to enter the world of grown-ups at all.
Which
really,
it is at that age. It's
mm-hmm.
like utterly terrifying, you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I was gonna go back to some of the like family dynamics quickly, is that we were talking about the father, but it's also, I guess, like interesting to talk about the mother and how she you know, she kind of has these outbursts actually about kind of I'll read one out where she says, "See that your marriage is happy, child. Don't ever let your husband know what you're thinking or doing. That's the way. My mother could have done anything she wanted. My father would have let her, even though probably he wouldn't have known." And then kind of, yeah, so she's kind of desperate for Natalie to not be in her same situation, but there's also a kind of jealousy and anger that she suspects that Natalie might not end up like her. It's like a weird kind of thing.
I marked out another one of her outbursts where she says, like, very specifically about sort of warning her against almost being close with her father in a weird way. So she says, it isn't anything else. Oh my god, I fucked it up. Right? It isn't any single thing I mind so much. Mrs. Waite sat up and took hold of Natalie's hands and looked earnestly into her eyes. It seemed somehow as though this at last was as though this at last were really true. And now, with all the words she knew, Mrs. Waite could not find unused ones or authentic ones, or words not debased by her lifetime of whimsy and lies, to tell Natalie that after all, this at last was really true. It isn't any single thing, Mrs. Waite repeated earnestly, the tears on her cheeks. It's just that, well, look, Natalie, this is the only life I've got, you understand. You mean this is all? And look at what's happening to me. I spend most of my time just thinking about how nice things used to be and wondering if they'll ever be nice again. If I should go on and die someday and nothing was ever nice again, wouldn't that be a fine thing? Wouldn't I have been cheated, don't you think? I get to feeling like that, and then I think I'll make things be nice. I'll make him behave and just make everything happy and exciting again the way it used to be, but I'm too tired. She lay back on the bed again, the tears still on her cheeks. When she had been eager to make Natalie understand the truth of what she was saying, she had not cried. But now, knowing from Natalie's timid smile and soothing pats that of course Natalie did not understand, she began to cry helplessly again. I keep telling you, she said finally, sadly, I keep telling you to watch out who you marry. Don't ever go near a man like your father. And obviously, like we talked about, like Natalie and her father have this very close bond, and this pre-arranged meeting every Sunday where, you know, Natalie goes into his office and presents him with what she's written during the week and he critiques it. And obviously the mother sort of knows that this is happening and that this is the arrangement, and it's sort of an unspoken thing in their house. And so she, I guess, knows that Natalie is sort of drawn maybe to men that are more academic or more erudite or less of a sort of house husband, you know, average Joe. And she's saying to Natalie, like, you know, be wary of that. And what's interesting is that later on, when Natalie goes to university and she meets the Langdons, and Langdon is one of her professors, and his wife Elizabeth, her father then in a letter to her warns her about getting too close to him too. So it's this weird, like, I don't know.
And there's definitely parallels between her mother and father and the Langdons. Even in that, I think the scene that you read out, her mother is drunk at the party, isn't it?
Yeah.
That part, yeah. So later on at university, when she kind of makes friends, is friendly with, you know, this professor that kind of everyone kind of fancies, and one of her classmates is having an affair with. You're not quite, I mean, it's not quite said, but it's kind of supposed. And and she ends up at these kind of academic parties and stuff, and it's exactly the same. She's kind of feeling like, oh, I've got to impress, this man, and then, she's helping the wife Elizabeth, when she's drunk and kind of having these outbursts. And it's the same dynamics between them, which is really interesting.
And it's like we were talking about that Natalie thinks that Natalie seems to think that her mother is stupid, whereas her mother is trying so hard to impart what little she does know to Natalie. This is what I know of the world. It might not be much, but this is good advice because I made a mistake. And Natalie very much will dismiss that because she doesn't think that talking of like household matters or marriage is like a worthy thing to talk about, I guess.
Yeah. What's also interesting is the whole kind of, talk that her father has about how, oh, at this age you'll start disliking me. And that's kind of said at the same time as the mother's giving these kind of warnings, and he's like, says this, he says to Natalie, you must remember that it is natural that hatred of me does not imply that you as a person hate me as a person, but only that the child growing normally passes through a stage where hatred of the parents is inevitable. That is your stage now. And then it says we must recognise now that you are a growing girl and I an old man, and that a basic sex antagonism combined with a filial resentment separates us so that we cannot always be honest with one another as we have been up to now. So it's strange. Again, it's kind of very Freudian, I guess.
And there's a bit later
he's kind of pushing her away, isn't he? He's kind of like, right, you're
a woman now.
I can't really engage with you in the same way as when you're a kind of sexless child.
And also later on when Natalie's at university and they're writing letters to each other, so they've written a few letters where it's like, dear Natalie, dear Dad, and then I've got the page number because I was like double checking to be like, is that right? Page 136, 137, they're writing letters to each other, but he refers to her as his captive princess, and she writes back, Sir Knight, which is like very weird, as if like he's her knight in shining, which is obviously like a thing that you would say about a love interest, like, my knight in shining armor, and like the fact that, her being away at university, her living her life is her being taken captive from her father, like her being taken away against her will, and she would much rather be there, which obviously she doesn't, because she feels quite free at university, and she quite enjoys having her own room and her own space, and it's sus bitchy to me.
and also I do think it's also interesting, like we hardly ever hear of him, but her brother, she kind of, it's quite interesting, the kind of dynamics in the family is that she the woman is kind of, now is expected to kind of help her mother prepare for this party that happens in the kind of opening section of the first section of the novel, and her brother's kind of like, yep, bye, I'm going, and it's not questioned. It's like, oh, of course, as a man he's probably got his own very important things to do, but as a woman it's not important. Nothing's that important that she can kind of go and spend her own time elsewhere. And it's also if we talk about what happens at the end of the first section, is that at the party she kind of, as you were saying before she's kind of talking to this man and trying to seem impressive, and he kind of ends up leading her, you know, away from the party, and it's suggested that he sexually assaults her. You don't know exactly what happened, but that's what's suggested. The last thing she says in that section is, Natalie thought so sick and she nearly said it out loud, is he going to touch me? And then it goes to her waking up the next day and she's in distraught, but
yeah. Oh, I love that, the way that section is written. It's like just in the aftermath where she's just woken up. And what is it that she says?
It's like
Yeah,
stream of
she says,
consciousness. She's like saying,
yeah, she says someday, well, it's not she saying this, it's like the narrator, but it says someday she thought it will be gone. Someday I'll be 60 years old, 67, 80, and remembering will perhaps recall that something of this sort happened once. Where, when, who, and will perhaps smile nostalgically, thinking, what a sad, silly girl I was, to be sure. How I worried, she would think. Would it have happened again by then? I won't think about it, she said. Won't think about it, won't think about it. Get up, she thought, so that someday, as quickly as possible, with infinite speed, somehow she might get to be 69, 84, forgetting, smiling sadly, thinking, what a girl I was, what a girl. I remember one time, did it happen to me or did I read it somewhere? Could it have happened like that, or is it something one only finds in books? I have forgotten, she would say, an old lady of 90, turning over her memories, which would be, please God, faded and mellowed by time. Oh, please, she said, sitting on the edge of her bed. Oh, please, oh, please. Just so sad. I think that's, again, even if you've not experienced any sort of trauma or assault as a teenager, I think that is so intrinsic, as well as that wishing away your time and picturing the time you're living in being something that you can look back on. I think that is so true. And yeah, that was beautifully written. I think that part.
and it's also really interesting is that after that section of writing, there's kind of a moment where she comes downstairs to the kind of breakfast table, and she kind of wonders, you know, she's looking at her family and she's like, do they know what's happened to me? And it's kind of, I guess, that kind of sickening feeling of, you know, she says, the most horrible moment of that morning and of that day, horrible in itself by being horrible with its sidelong, suspicious, knowing, perceiving looks from her mother and father, heavy amusement from her brother, horrible with remembered words and an impossible remembered acts. And it's you know, and at the same time, like she later on in that same section says, she kind of looks over at her brother and she's like, no one ever knows what he's been doing. So she's kind of got in her head this kind of inner dialogue, oh, they must know, do they know, you know, and then also like, you know, well, why do they care about what I've been doing when they don't care about what my brother's been doing? I mean, like we've said, he's hardly ever mentioned. He's just having his own life, you know.
And the thing is, when Natalie goes to university and she's exchanging letters with her dad, and he has all this knowledge of what's going on and who she's associating with, and then when she comes back home and they're at the dinner table and they're like, oh, how is school? And her brother's like, oh, fine. And she's like, oh, fine. But you know, I mean, obviously it's from Natalie's POV, so maybe they know, the parents know more about the brother, but I think it's sort of suggested that they don't really. Yeah.
But it also, you know, it's such a horrible section because you kind of assume, even if, you know, which is likely that they didn't know what, you know, the family didn't know what happened, but you know, even so, for her to think, you know, kind of think, do they know? And for the kind of be kind of, well, not okay, but like understand the kind of reality of, oh, them thinking, instead of going, oh, you know, poor you, like you need help, we need to, you know, take this to the police or something, you know, that she's kind of okay with them, with the idea that they might just be ashamed of her.
Yeah.
It's
That she's the
really
one who's done
bad.
something wrong, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That it's shameful, and her kind of being okay with the idea that they're, you know, not there to kind of protect her, I guess.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
But should we go to move
The
on
next
to university?
and so I guess, yeah, the next question is how does she make that transition, and how does it sort of affect her, which is a very big question, and obviously that's the what the
Yeah.
majority of the novel is about, is Natalie's mental state in this transition.
Oh, we've paused. Anna?
Did you freeze? Oh no.
Did
Did you freeze or did I freeze? Or did we both freeze?
I think you freezed a few, yeah, for a few seconds. I don't know if it was me or you,
We're
but
back, I think, hopefully. Yeah.
it's always so frightening when that happens.
I know. Um, but yeah, so I was saying that this is a very big question, because obviously the majority of the novel is about how Natalie makes this transition from home to school, and spoiler, it's not not well, right? She
No, I mean, I found, you know, like you said, at near the beginning, I think she does find aspects of it quite freeing, but then
Mhm.
very quickly it
Yeah.
becomes as, you know, imprisoning as the
Mhm.
home life, because she's kind of stuck in this, you know, with all these kind of social rules that she doesn't quite understand between the girls and her, and you know, and there's, she doesn't really have any friends, any
Mhm.
kind of anything to kind of anchor her down in, you know, and kind of keep her from going, you know, astray.
Yeah.
And it's incredibly lonely, and
Mhm.
it's heartbreaking. I mean, I remember feeling just, you know, just like that at the start of university. You don't know anything, and you know, in halls, you know, that there wasn't anyone that I was really, you know, close to, and you kind of got this dread. I remember feeling this dreadful feeling like, oh, if I, you know, if I came home to, if I didn't come home to
Mhm.
my room in halls, like no one would really notice,
Mhm.
because I wasn't, you know, friends with them, and it's kind of that feeling like it is in some aspects freeing, because you can now, you know, she says kind of at the start, oh, I can, you know, stay up late, I can, you know, read when I want and things like that. But at the same time, it's kind of, you, there's a kind of train of kind of, I guess, thought that you can go into when you're like, you know, you become, you've kind of fit that you might just become invisible, because there's no other kind of, I don't know, it's no one who knows you, no one, you know, who knows that you're there.
And right at the beginning of that section where she begins school, and it's a little bit before she's even excited and stuff. So this is literally like foreshadowing what the entirety of the book is gonna be. But it begins and it says, anything which begins new and fresh will finally become old and silly. The educational institution is certainly no exception to this, although training the young is by implication an art for old people exclusively, and novelty in education is allied to mutiny. So it very much, we know from the get-go pretty much that this is not going to go very well.
And obviously she's getting to the university in a not very good mental state from the start because of what happened at the end of the last section, the sexual assault. She's, you know, going there in an incredibly vulnerable state.
And I remember that, you know, she's, you know, carving out this room, and there is so much excitement in that. And then there's this moment later on where I think some of the other girls like make reference to something that she had in her room, or that they read a book that she had or something. And basically she asks how they even got into her room, and they say that, oh well, all of the keys on the same on this floor, so that they can all, and that's kind of what you were talking
I think
about
it's
that
the numbers.
anonymity.
It's like
Yeah,
if you
it's
have
like not,
9,
yeah,
if you have, say, room 9, your room 9 key will open room 19. It's
yeah,
something like that. It's
how basically, anyone can have access. And she sort of, after that, has this sort of jiggy system where she keeps the key in the door when she's in there, so that no one can come in, because if the key's already in the door, no one can use their key. So it's all this, and you know, setting up little traps and stuff so that she knows that people have been in there. It's like this desperate urge to carve out space that's just for her, and being kind of thwarted at every opportunity, basically.
and that kind of, you know, brings along the kind of, like, it's strange because it's like she feels both kind of invisible and watched at once. And I guess the kind of invisibility comes from feeling like no one really cares what happens to her, but everyone, you know, even though no one cares or really truly like sees her, they still are kind of judging her, and you know, and there's that kind of, I mean, we've talked about it before with Cat's Eye and stuff. I was gonna bring up the kind of Alison Winch's idea of the kind of girlfriend gaze, and kind of the kind of watching and kind of judging other women, because of course this university she's at, it's all girls, and there's lots of cliques and hierarchies, and my voice is going. And it's Winch's girlfriend gaze. It's all about the kind of idea of girls and their kind of, you know, it's labelled sometimes as a kind of strategic sisterhood. So you want to make friends with girls that will give you a leg up on the social hierarchy.
Yeah, for sure.
And there's also kind of with that the kind of idea of the kind of Panopticon, which we talked about with Cat's Eye, which is obviously kind of from the kind of concept of the kind of prison, where there's, you know, there will be, you know, the kind of cells, and then a prison guard will sit in the middle and be able to watch everyone from, you know, all directions. So it's kind of, although it's, you know, came from this idea of this kind of way to structure a prison building, it's kind of become a kind of phrase to kind of, I guess, or concept of kind of a way in which society runs, where everyone is being watched and watching each other and kind of critiquing each other. And
yeah.
But I found I was gonna read out, hopefully my voice won't go, but I was gonna read out this bit where she just gets to the college, and I think it's before the kind of initiation, which we'll get to. But it's when they're kind of just first all meet, and it's, I'll start reading it. It says, they sat around the living room of the house, the girls who were to live in it, eyeing one another. Oh, I've already screwed up. Eyeing one another, each one wondering perhaps which of the others was to be her particular friend, sought out hereafter at such meetings, joined in the terrible sacred friendships of these years. Each one wondering perhaps who was it just and right to be afraid of in the room, who, for instance, was to be the belle of the house, superior and embarrassing with her greater knowledge, her secrets. The ones who had been senior queens in high school stood out. One or two who had been in my voice, oh my gosh. The one or two who had been high school class historians were clearly marked, as were the students, the learners of facts, the eccentric amateur writers with their poems safely locked away upstairs. The hangers-on were there, eyeing the beauty queens, estimating clearly which one it were best to appropriate immediately. The poor ones with their obvious best clothes, the smart ones with their obvious right clothes. The girls who would teach the others to dance, the girls who would whisper inaccurate facts of life, the girls who would fail all their courses and go home ingloriously, saying goodbye bravely but crying, the girls who will fail all their courses and join the best cliques, the girls who will fall in love with their professors either desperately and secretly or openly and disgracefully, the girls whose hearts would break and the girls whose spirits would break. A group of girls from whatever kind of homes with whatever agonised mothers wandering tonight at home, herded uneasily together into one room to await the preliminary steps of an education. So it's kind of, it's such a lovely section when they're all kind of eyeing each other up and being like, who are you? Like, should I connect with you or should I avoid you? Will that, cause my social downfall if I, became friends with this person? Oh, you paused.
Oh no. My God.
Thank God you came back.
That's so embarrassing. I'm so sorry, everybody. I keep leaving. I don't know if it's because my dad's watching football or what. Like, I don't know. My Wi-Fi is just
be me. I mean, I don't know if there's a way to tell who it is.
When did I cut off? What was I saying?
I think you just started speaking.
Oh, yeah. I was saying also in that section that you read out, the knowledge that not everyone will make it. And not even in a sinister way, just in
some Hunger Games.
Some people will drop out, some people will embarrass themselves by falling in love with professors and be sort of socially ousted by the rest of them. There's already this knowledge when there's at the very beginning sizing each other up, not all of them are one worthy and two going to be there, so that you got to pick your friends, because you don't want to pick someone who then embarrasses themselves and then by definition you as well, so weird.
It is so weird. And there was a lot of actually you know, in the biography of Shirley Jackson, of kind of her and her diaries, kind of, you know, at high school, she was kind of, as she put it, kind of left with the kind of on ideals, you know, and kind of was friends with it's she's quite cruel about these other people being like, oh, you know, like they're not gonna kind of get me anywhere, and those
Oh,
kind of
Shirley.
I know it's strange, but yeah.
I guess especially at that time as well, when, you know, obviously the world was just very different for women, and you didn't want to be stuck with the women who were going to just be housewives. If there were women who were sort of destined for bigger things, you did almost want to, you know, sort of like attach your wagon to them, and in the hope that they might pull you up, because there was such an easy sort of slide into just mundanity and you know,
I think
housewifery.
I think that's the issue for, you know, both Natalie and kind of Shirley, is that, you know, a lot of the ideals in these social circles would be the girls who would become housewives, you know, a bit like Elizabeth, you know,
Yeah.
it's that's kind of the ideal. But, you know, who do you go with if you're not wanting to go down that route? And, you know, you're kind of left with, you know, I guess in their minds, you know, not very strong contesters.
Yeah. And we touched on it earlier as well, which is that, you know, this idea of the ancient idea of like the school initiation, which they do like in the middle of
Which
the
is
night.
very like the lottery, didn't you think? Like
Yeah.
the way it's, which is of course like Shirley Jackson's really famous like short story.
I just found
Of
it quite funny because it's just so underwhelming. Like the girls, they get like
it's
woken up in the middle of the night, and they get and
yeah,
everyone's like, "Oh, where are we going?" And it's really exciting, and then it's really fucking boring because they like sit them down and they're like, "Tell us your best dirty joke or something," and it's like,
yeah,
"Oh." Like, is that it? And they're just like sitting, waiting around. And there's a really fun. It was not funny. I mean, I found it funny, but there's a small bit where Natalie's sort of sitting at this initiation, and it crossed Natalie's mind then that if she had stayed in her room quietly and never heeded the call to frosh, she would have been overlooked, since no one seemed to care about those who did not come. With this in mind, Natalie turned cautiously and scanned the ranks of freshmen for the red-haired girl, but did not find her. Another instance, she thought regretfully, or at least remembered later that she had thought, of ritual gone to seed. The persecution of new students, once passionate, is now only perfunctory. So this
yeah.
sort of like excitement that, you know, she's part of it, and then realizing that, like, okay, it's not that exciting, it's a bit boring, but at least I'm not left in the dorm, at least I'm part of something. It's just very funny to
And
me.
then
Like, this sort
you
of,
know, done.
yeah.
It's like the whole initiation kind of ceremony, as it
Mm,
was, kind of all done with absolutely no kind of, you know, passion for it. It's kind of just like, which is why it's like the lottery. It's like this ritual that they don't even know where it began or
mhm,
why, or, you know, no one cares. The only thing it is, and it's quite like, you know, it's almost like they're only doing it because the older girls are only continuing it because they want to get back at the old girls who did it to them when they
yeah.
first came here. It's kind of very
Or they think it will mean something if they don't
punishing.
do it.
Yeah,
Yeah, like they're only
yeah,
doing it because it's part of a cycle that was done to them.
yeah,
Um, yeah, it's very bizarre, that whole thing, because I remember reading it being like, "Oh, what's gonna happen? Like, is this gonna
yeah.
be be really creepy? Like, are they gonna do something weird? Like, you know, witchy. Like, that's kind of the vibes that you get, like a gathering of girls in the middle of the night. It just
Yeah.
has, you know, these connotations, and it's just so boring. And you're like, oh, like,
And
okay.
and
And I
poor
think that's
Natalie doesn't say
yeah.
the right thing, does
No.
she?
And that's just
She
so
yeah.
indicative of, like, the whole teenage experience of, like, really, really building something up in your head and then it finally happening and you're like, "Oh, alright."
Yeah. No one's quite ready to fully commit to it.
Exactly.
But
Just very
yeah, no,
underwhelming.
it's yeah, so they ask first, are you a virgin, to the
Mm,
girls, and then they ask, tell us a dirty joke.
mhm,
Um and she watches girls pass, obviously, I guess at this time, the 1950s, it wouldn't be very, I guess, oh, how do you put it? Like, the girls who kind of pass will be the ones that are virgins and kind of
mm.
haven't,
The more conservative
they're more
girls. Yeah.
conservative, yeah. And what Natalie does is that she just says, when they ask her, she just says, I won't answer.
Mm,
Um, and obviously they take that to mean that she isn't, or even just that it's a strange answer to them, because all the others kind
yeah.
of just blushed and said, oh, you know,
Yeah.
yeah.
Mhm.
So that's pretty sad, that
No, it is really hard.
especially because also, like, what we know that she's been through
Yeah.
very recently, it's like,
And that she doesn't even know how to define it really herself and
yeah, I mean, she might just not know, like, how
mm,
do you.
yeah.
Yeah.
Mm. No, it is really sad. So yeah, so we've got, you know, obviously the really horrible thing happening to Natalie at the party, and then there's this big change going to university, and you know, she doesn't really get in with the right people. She is very underwhelmed by this initiation. Her personal space starts to be encroached upon. She meets the Langdons, who we've already spoken a little bit about, that they're sort of reflections of her parents and sort of, I guess, just a reminder of what Natalie doesn't want in life, really. Like,
Mm.
because Elizabeth is who she meets first, and she goes round to Elizabeth's house, and Elizabeth is sort of drinking and smoking quite heavily and being like, oh, it was a mistake to marry my lecturer, because she married the guy who was her lecturer, and now
Mm.
she's not a student anymore. Um, and so I guess Elizabeth is like this sort of cautionary tale to Natalie, and she's very sort of convinced that she doesn't want to end up like that. And there's Rosalind, who's just this annoying girl
Mm.
that Natalie's very sort of scathing about. So she's really not finding anyone that she can
She's like
confide in.
completely alone.
Yeah,
It's
until
so upsetting until, well, I was
should
gonna
we, should we
I was
switch,
gonna
or are we still on this topic?
I was gonna say that just before we switch is the kind of, which I guess that this section does come, after we meet, who,
Mm,
but so we know that, Natalie is of course feeling very lonely and out of place at university, and then, there's a bit later in the book where she does go home after,
mhm,
going to university, and I just thought it kind of, there's just like one little bit where she's saying how her mother and father keep assuring her warmly of the fact that she was always welcome in her house, always welcome, with the clear implication that she was thus always a visitor there. So
mhm.
it's kind of this idea that she's in this kind of liminal transitional place between
Yeah.
kind of teenage and adulthood where she just doesn't have a home because university isn't home and home's not home anymore, and it's like,
Yeah.
where does she go next? She's completely isolated and, you know, already kind of traumatized by this sexual assault, and I guess that actually leads into what we're going to talk about next, is that basically her kind of psychosis.
Yeah, I mean, just before we do, I mean, just to sort of, I was interested in what you said because I think we hardly ever go through a whole Briar's book club discussion without mentioning liminal space. But what you were talking about there, and I marked out another quote which again communicates exactly that, of Natalie not existing anywhere really. And I think it's the beginning of the last section. They're not really chapters, but it's just like there's like a page break, and it's the beginning of the page break. And it says, "It must be assumed that at one point, to be known as there was the college, dark and drowsy under Natalie's absence, and that at another point, known as here, was the home where her mother and father and brother lived, and to which she had been brought during a passage of time that in retrospect seemed nothing, so that her transition from there to here seemed no more than a fading in of one place upon another, a travel between points in time rather than space." So it talks about how, at one point the home was like here where she is, and the school was somewhere else, and then it becomes the point where the school is where she is and home is somewhere else, and this sort of weird shift that you don't even really realize is happening until it has already happened. And like you say, she feels like a visitor in her own home. And I think it's this which is really the sort of, like you say, the starting point for her break, which is like the beginning of the next question, which is Tony a real person or just a figment of Natalie's increasingly deteriorating imagination? Which I think is really sort of the main question that people come up with. I think obviously so much of the novel is suggestive, so much of it is sort of, eerie, but this is the one thing that, like, you're like, this either isn't real or, this is the one thing that people are like, this isn't a real thing, and I think there are other things that can be discussed and certain things that are strange. Maybe Natalie's an unreliable narrator, maybe she's misremembering certain things, but there's just this one character, Tony, who's a friend at school who just doesn't fit. And we've already established that Natalie has a very vivid imagination, from the opening of the book where she's, picturing this police interrogation and this like lavish inner life that she wants for herself. We know that she has really fanciful ideas, and potentially this, this loneliness and isolation, like, forces her as a coping mechanism to make up this friend that she now sees, that I think she pretty much only sees when no one else is really around.
There's certain instances where, other people are around, but they're kind of, it's because I remember there's one where the Professor Langdon kind of says, "Oh, you're going over to that, you're spending a lot of time at Tony's." I mean, he doesn't say at Tony's, but
it's like, "Oh, like, you're going to that place or something," and at first I thought
a lot,
he
and it's
meant
kind
like,
of
it's weird.
It's kind of no one's. It's kind of everyone really knows that she's not well, but is kind of willing to kind of not say anything and just kind of go along with it in a way.
And that bit, where we talked about where she has just come back home, come back to the university from home. So obviously she's feeling a bit raw, I think, and out of place. And she heads straight to Tony's room. And on their way, she bumps into Langdon, who says that cryptic thing about, "Oh, you've been spending a lot of time there." And she's making lots of efforts not to be seen. And she's sort of ducking in the corridors, and then suddenly she can hear the girl, like when she's in Tony's room, she can hear the girls in that dorm at the door sort of whispering and giggling. And then Tony says something really weird about how they're all beasts and she would love to torture them. And so in a way you think, is Tony just like Natalie's like baser instincts in a way? Like it's just another side of Natalie that she doesn't let herself, indulge in, and therefore it's taken form as this like imaginary person.
Yeah, no, that bit's so it's so horrible. I mean, I'll just read out a little bit. She would have to pass them all, and the question was whether to walk with dignity or make a run for it. There was a light she could see shining through the transom of the door at the end of the hall, and she straightened her shoulders, almost laughed at herself, and then began to walk with quiet, sure steps down the hall. She attracted no notice from the first open room. No one even looked up, but the second open room was filled with girls, lounging on the bed and the floor, and someone noticed her and called, "Hey, here she comes." Without turning her head, she was aware of the girls crowding to the doorway, and knew what their half-audible voices said and how their eyes looked, following her down the hall. The noise brought girls to the doorways all up and down the hall, and even ahead of her. Natalie saw doors opening. She pretended to be trying not to smile, and she walked without turning her head to the last door on the left. When she hesitated before the door, she heard the great mocking silence up and down the hall, and an echoing burst of laughter and jeering which almost obscured her knock. Then she lost her courage, feeling them all watching her, and knowing that this door was rarely locked, she opened it without invitation and slipped inside. Standing then with the door safely shut behind her, she took a long breath and laughed. Outside she could hear giggling and the sound of footsteps coming softly down, almost to the door and then turning back. The sounds of many girls all together saying to each other hilarious things meant to be heard beyond the door. So it's just this horrible, where they're just, she's like a kind of circus act to them, like,
Yeah.
here's that. I remember.
And it's horrific that if she, is in some psychotic break and her mind has created Tony as some sort of coping mechanism because she's so alone, is that she's not even left at peace with that. She can't even have that hallucination, have that in peace. That's still encroached upon by the surrounding girls. Yeah.
It's horrible.
And we talked about it's sort of, it seems obvious at first that Tony's not real because it's only really Natalie that talks to her. But there is that scene when they've sort of like unofficially run away together. So basically it's after this moment where Natalie comes to Tony's room, she stays the night there, they sleep in the same bed, and people have read like a sapphic interpretation into that, and potentially like maybe that's why Natalie was so horrified by that man wanting to touch her. Maybe that's part of it, but also just potentially she's a teenage girl and doesn't want to be touched by a man. That's also a valid reading of it. But then after this, Tony makes a reference to, oh, we have a meeting at 10 because you're on like academic watch or something, because she's not been to classes Natalie's not been to classes in 2 weeks. And so they go, oh, okay, well, we'll go out to town before the meeting. And then they just sort of don't really remember this meeting. They go out to town and they do all these different things. They get on a train. And then they're at the station, and then there's this whole interaction which made me think, oh, is Tony real? Because they speak to this diner at the train station who has one arm, and then Tony helps him like cut up his food. And I'm like, okay, well, either Tony's a real person and someone else can see her, or Natalie's just imagining more people.
I think, no, I took that scene, I think, to mean that I think that they knew that that this other person that Tony was helping, with the food and stuff, that they knew that she wasn't well, because I think I mean, I can't remember it exactly, but I think they kind of things are mostly directed at kind of one of them, and there's this kind of like, they're like, oh, say thanks to your friend, you know, and
Right.
it's I think it probably is a real person, but they kind of just went along with what Natalie was saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really heartbreaking, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just looking at that section now.
Yeah,
And
I've
that bit
forgotten
where,
the
yeah,
name.
they have this very lavish, again, sort of fantasy life where they're referring to people that neither of them know really. And then they refer to Langdon as like as if it's a pet dog that they both share, which I thought was quite strange. Like again, it's this sort of nasty side of Natalie, which maybe she doesn't, maybe she lets Tony
Yeah,
sort of be that side of her, and that side maybe that she's kept back from her father, like in her various writings and descriptions, like she keeps that back because it's not appropriate for maybe young women to be saying these things. Um, and then her father, like at one point as well, when she's at home, she's quite out of it and not herself. And he says something like, "Oh, you just need to change your perspective to become a worthwhile person." And he says something that made me laugh, so I marked it out. But he said like, uh, "I'm still dealing with my own adolescent hangovers. I don't need to be dealing with yours," or something along those lines. And it's like, he doesn't have a lot of time for, I guess, her more sort of just childish outbursts, really. Like
yeah,
it's clear that he thinks very highly of her, and I think obviously she values that. But in that way, it means that she does sort of feel like she needs to police her emotions and
oh,
maybe
yeah,
the more unladylike things that she's thinking, and perhaps Tony is like a manifestation of all of those cruel things that she's not allowed to think or say. I don't know.
mm. I found it really interesting actually, reading this, some of this biography of Jackson, because she kept diaries and notebooks of her work where she kind of spoke in kind of two
Mm,
voices. So she kind of spoke to her diary like, oh, like, hey, I had a fantastic day today, kind of like from the perspectives of, so I guess, someone she should be, and then she'd like kind of critique it and think, kind of like, no, you didn't, like, would write a comment underneath, or like, and then also she also had like, I can't remember if she like wrote, I think it was that she wrote these down, but she had like different people for her like different emotions, and she like
mm,
referred them by different names and stuff, and then wrote kind of from their perspective and stuff, and then also, I mean, it says that, Hangsaman is supposedly her most kind of autobiographical book out of all the ones that she's written, and she did, the first kind of university she went to, she went to and the second one is where she met her husband,
mm,
um but the first one she went to, Rochester, I think it was called, she had a breakdown and was forced to leave, um so I guess there's must be, a lot from that kind of, time, when she was there. I think she did meet a really close friend, but the friend she left, I think, halfway through, or was only there for a short period of time, and then after that I think things deteriorated more. So
mm.
she must have, been through this kind of agonizing, kind of loneliness at university, and kind of between homes, and she didn't like the kind of town where it was. I think where she went to university was the same town that they'd kind of the family had moved to.
Mm.
So, you know, she wasn't living at home for the first year or so, but, you know, she was just trapped.
Yeah.
But
No, and it's
yeah.
interesting what you say is that, it's not documented that actually a student did go missing and that was her sort of
Mm.
jumping off point. I mean, maybe,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's really interesting because I mean I don't know exactly because I've not read the whole biography. It's a very long. I'll just try and like search it up because it's called like a haunted
Life, yeah.
a haunted life, and it's Ruth Franklin, and
Mhm.
I think she'd obviously gone into archives of you know um and she went right back into kind of Shirley's family history and all this, and from her findings she couldn't find concrete evidence that
Mhm.
obviously this missing girl thing, it did happen,
Yeah.
um but I think there wasn't like she found that
I mean,
there
it could
wasn't
just be so
conclusive
simple
evidence.
that she saw the headline and just subconsciously that she started
Yeah,
thinking about that time in her
thinking
life
that
when
exact, yeah,
she felt the same and she felt
yeah,
alone and she felt trapped. And so the case of the missing girl, it says at the back, actually it doesn't say on the back, but I think in the film Shirley, or it's suggested that this university student goes missing in the woods, and that's where we
yeah,
end the novel. So I mean, I guess that's
yeah,
maybe the strongest tie that was an inspiration. And we can sort of talk about maybe that ending bit now, that whole
yeah,
section in the woods, which is just it's just quite horrific, if I'm honest with
yeah.
you. Like, um, so yeah, what did you think of the ending? Is it a happy one? Do we leave Natalie better or worse than we found her? And I guess this is the one where I think, if you've read it, I would appreciate your feedback the most because it's such a bizarre ending. It's just so like the last few pages are quite horrifying, and then the last paragraph is just very out of left field, very tonally different. Um, so yeah, so I guess just a brief refresher if you read it a while ago, or even if you're here and you've not read it, let's just get into what happens. So Natalie and Tony are on this sort of excursion, and then they get on a bus, and Natalie is sort of sitting apart from Tony. They can't get a seat together, and she sort of panics that everyone's pressed in on her, and it's just very like anxiety driven section, and the bus just like keeps going and she doesn't know when they're getting off, and when they finally do, it's dark and she doesn't know how it's gotten so dark. It's very disorientating. It's like, when you go into the cinema and it's light out and then you come out and
Yeah,
it's dark and you're like, what the fuck, like how did that happen?
yeah,
It sort of, I mean, didn't remind me of that, but it's like that sort of disorientating feeling of like not knowing where the time is going. And then when they get off this bus, she doesn't know where they are. And the driver is like, oh, are you sure? This is the end of the line. I'm going back now. Are you sure you don't want to come back? And she's like, no, I don't want to. I'm fine. And then the bus like speeds away, and she's very aware of the fact that that's like the last bus that's heading back home, essentially back to where she wants to be. And then her and Tony like venture into the woods, or this sort of weird playground, is it that they're in?
yeah.
And
Or
Natalie's like,
fairground, or is it a
yeah.
yeah,
And she's like, well, Natalie's kind of like, oh, well, I don't want to stay too long if it's cold. And she's really trying to angle for them to head back. And Tony's like, oh, are you afraid? And it's just this very bizarre section. And then Natalie quickly loses Tony in the woods, and she's sort of wandering around in a panic and gets picked up by a family, like a couple, I think. um and they ask her like, are you all right? Why are you in the road on your own? On your
yeah,
own. That's the implication, is it, that she's
yeah,
not with anybody. And they take her back to the town, and then she gets out and she's back, she can like see the campus, she's near the university. And then she goes up to the bridge and she sort of looks over it, and she sort of contemplates jumping, or she like it sort of crosses her mind. And I can read out that bit because it's just a very
mm,
small section, and then it ends, and then obviously we can sort of discuss how that ends. But so this is her on the bridge. More people were nearby on the bridge, but she was not embarrassed to turn away from the parapet and walk quietly toward the college. It occurred to her that unless she actually jumped over the parapet into the river, she was of small interest to them. As she passed, she looked into their faces, and they were laughing or talking or walking quietly along, and none of them did more than slide a look past Natalie, who was walking quietly along without interest. The reassuring bulk of the college buildings showed ahead of her, and she looked fondly up at them and smiled. As she had never been before, she was now alone and grown up and powerful and not at all afraid. Which, if you were to predict what the last lines of this book would be when you were in the middle of the book, or even like mere pages before the end, that's not what you would picture how the book ends at all.
It's
Like
really
I sort of thought it would end with her in the woods and she would just sort of pass
yeah.
out and it would be very sad. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I found it because obviously, the book is called Hangsaman, and it's kind of inspired by an old like folk song.
Yeah, the one
Um,
at the beginning, right?
yeah, and it has a little kind of section at the beginning, and it's I'll read out a little bit that I kind of wrote about it. It's a centuries-old folk song with many variants from many different countries. It's sometimes known as the maid freed from the gallows, and also sometimes known as the prickly bush, and lots of other names. And it's about a woman pleading to a hangman to reconsider her hanging, and she waits for someone to bribe him. Her parents slash family, they arrive with nothing, and they intend to just watch her get hanged. And then the last person who arrives ends up bringing the gold, silver, or treasure. It changes in different versions to supposedly, to try to save them. And often the saviour is kind of named as their true love. However, in traditional versions of the ballad, the woman's fate is left unclear. So even though this person arrives with this thing, it's unclear whether they succeeded in bribing the hangman. And I found that really interesting because it's kind of like you kind of feel like throughout the kind of whole novel, it's kind of like she's trying to be saved from something. Her parents, that her family are not willing to do that, and are kind of just watching her go through, both her family and friends, professors are kind of just watching her go through this psychotic episode without assisting her or helping her. And then this person, Tony, comes up to save the day.
Yeah.
And it's kind of, and obviously her fate at the end of the book is left unknown, and it's kind of, it's kind of like, is the ending a kind of her accepting that she's now going to save herself, or is it, has she gone through the this, has she finished this kind of episode, and has she, it's and another kind of section of the I mean, obviously there's different variants and stuff, but another section that I found interesting on the kind of just found on the Wikipedia page about it, which is why it's sometimes called the prickly bush, is that there's a bit that goes that goes the are you thinking of
You know what I'm thinking? Sorry. Carry on. Oh, I'm so immature. Sorry.
not that kind of prickly bush.
Why am I crying? I'm like a 12-year-old boy. Oh my god. Okay, carry on. Sorry.
Oh, the prickly bush. The prickly bush. It pricked my. I can't take it seriously. Oh, prickly bush. The prickly bush. It pricked my heart. Full sore. If I ever get out of the prickly bush, I'll never get in anymore. And it's kind of like all this, kind of section of the folk ballad where she's talking about this tricky situation that she's got herself into, that she might be hanged, and how do I get out of it? And I will try and not get back into this situation again. And I kind of feel like it kind of potentially ends a bit like that, is that she's kind of perhaps acknowledged that she's been through this episode or something, and then there's maybe a bit of hope that she'll kind of get out of the prickly bush and maybe things will get better, but it's unclear, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, that's sort of what I thought, is that is this an uplifting ending in the sense that she has hit rock bottom, and that maybe because of that, now whatever happens, she feels equipped to handle that section is very telling, that one line which says she's now a grown-up, and she's alone. And so maybe you think, oh, has she realized that Tony isn't real? Like, she is alone and she is a grown-up, like she's on her own now. She has no need for hallucinations anymore. Like, she's fine. She can fix it,
maybe she feels she's got to let go of her kind of it's almost a bit like, what's it called, like maladaptive daydreaming. It's a type of kind of I don't know if it's necessarily like defined as like a proper kind of condition, but it's like when you kind of daydreaming takes over your life. And obviously that's not what's happening by the end. By the end it's kind of full-on psychosis, but she's not, because obviously if you're with maladaptive daydreaming, you are still aware that it's daydreams, not reality, but it's kind of, that's how it kind of, it starts kind of as that. And
because she is aware, like when she's daydreaming the detective, it's not real, but it's like an indulgence. And then somehow I think maybe in the sort of in the setting of university where she is so alone, it becomes something a bit more sinister, whereas that she's not aware that it's she's not in her control, essentially. Sylvie has said some things in the chat. So I'm not sure what I thought of the whole end sequence, but it was definitely not what I would predict. It did take me a long time to read the book, so I wasn't sure if that was why it felt so jarring. And I felt this too, in a sense that it took me ages to read the book, and that's partly why this was a bit late, and also life was busy. But I felt this in the sense that it just felt very almost not that you were cheated, but like I felt like I'd spent a lot of time with Natalie. But this was like a very quick like send off. We don't really see her back safe, and you're sort of like, oh, like we want to see that she's back in the college and that she's safe, and you sort of feel that you're owed that because you spent all this time with her. But then Sylvie's gone on to say, she is such an unreliable narrator, as you say. I wonder if Tony does represent a real person and something happened, but Natalie is almost rewriting her memories about it. And then she can have a transformational after, which could also be the case, So, there's the suggestion, obviously there's a suggestion that she underwent some sort of physical sexual assault at this party. It's entirely possible that maybe something similar happened at university or at the college, and that she has sort of made up this story around it to maybe I don't know, make it more palatable or make it less sinister. I don't know.
Yeah, because there also is the bit that, you know, I think it's when she first meets Tony, and it's at a party at the
Langdons.
Langdons, and she's sitting on the steps outside, and it's all kind of too much for her, and then there's this beautiful bit where she's like, oh, she's looking at the trees, and then she's like, oh, and one tree's moving towards me, and then it's Tony, and it's, they kind of talk, and then I think Elizabeth says to Natalie later, I saw you talking with someone earlier or something, but you don't know quite if she's actually saying I did see you with someone, or if she's kind of gently saying, oh, you know, I saw you talking to someone, you know, to, you know, and kind of asking, oh, who were you talking to when there was no one there?
Also,
If you know what I mean.
yeah, I mean, maybe I'm being a bit too like English A level about it, but what you said just then was really beautiful. I was thinking about how you said that sort of Tony comes out of the trees, comes out of the forest, and then that's where they end up. So maybe it's like, in a weird way, you know, Tony emerges from the trees, and then that's where Natalie has to go to sort of put her to rest in a way. So it's like this cyclical thing. I don't know. Maybe like I said, I'm just being a bit too like English A level, where it's like read into things that aren't there.
Well, it is really interesting, actually. It's I'll read the little bit. The porch was actually only a miserable excuse for a place to sit. It was no more than a step up or a step down, so that sitting on the porch steps at the Langdons' house meant the knees under the chin and the feet awkwardly placed and the back twisted. But the same trees were outside, living in the ground without curiosity about the insides of houses, and growing towards death as surely as Natalie. When one tree demonstrated that it was not rooted and perhaps not completely indifferent by disengaging itself from the others and coming towards Natalie, where she sat on the porch step, she was not surprised. It was an odd night anyway. And then the day after tomorrow, she should be going home for a while, and said only with some crossness, I don't want to talk. And then Tony says, all right. And it's how she kind of enters does seem like it's part of, you know, in her mind. And
Yeah.
because even the way they talk, you know, she just goes, it feels like a narrative, kind of conversation in her head, that she's like, oh, I don't want to talk, you know, I don't want to think about this, you know.
Or like not now, like
Yeah.
she's in, you know, sort of in public with, you know, people. Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, we both loved it, but I do see why it would be a book that leaves people like frustrated. Like I was looking at Goodreads, and there are lots of people that don't like this book. So out of curiosity, I think Sylvie's probably the only one that's still with us and the only one that's read it. But I would be very curious to see, Sylvie, like what you thought ultimately of the book. I know you said it took a while to read, which I also same. But I'd be curious to see like where people come down on it, because it is a very strange book, and also it's a very sad book, so to be like, oh, I loved it, it's like but I think
it's really sad
talking about it, like the richness of the language and just the sort of, even like the small thing, because you know the book is essentially, yeah, it's about, you know, Natalie having this break, and this sort of, is this real, is this not real, this creeping atmosphere. But then so many of the little really like really small details are just so spot on, like the whole sort of daydreaming with the detective, and I love that section, and I love the whole thing about this sort of feeling very like underwhelmed with like how things actually are at school, and she's just so accurately captured so much of that time. which I think is very impressive because obviously,
Yeah.
she's writing it as an adult, I presume.
Yeah.
And to be so in tune with that is just quite remarkable, I think. Yeah, I would, yeah. I'm just rambling now.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah,
I
I
think
think
it was right of you sort of to mention Cat's Eye earlier, and I was trying to think, like, obviously it's a bit unfair to compare them because, like, completely different tones, completely different subject matters and themes and stuff, but also like a lot of similarities. And I was trying to think, like, okay, in terms of something that has really captured what it is to be a teenager, like which one did I think, I guess, did it not better. I mean, it feels stupid to even say that, be like, who did it best, but trying to think like which one sort of struck me the most, and they both do in
yeah,
very
they're
different
very
ways.
different. Yeah,
Mm.
no, I agree.
Yeah, I don't know if there's one that I could say I preferred really.
Yeah, I feel like they're at the same kind of level for me
Yeah.
because there's so much depth to them both,
Mm.
and so many kind of different. I like books where you can come
Mhm.
to lots of different conclusions, and
Yeah.
you know, and yeah,
I think
I
what I
mean,
really love about Cat's Eye is that you've got the dual storyline of her as a teenager and her as an adult, and looking back on
yeah,
those memories. That's what I find interesting about that. Whereas Hangsaman is very much you're just dropped in the mindset of
yeah,
Natalie, and it's so alienating, but that's also so powerful in its own way.
yeah,
Mm. Sylvie says, like you say, not a fun book, but I did love how well the anxious state of being was captured and the language she uses and her writing are fantastic. Yeah, definitely. I think this is my it's my first Shirley Jackson, but it's not going to be my last for sure. I think, I mean, I've read bits and pieces of her stuff.
I've
Like, I've read just
yeah,
the
I've
Lottery and
read
the
We
Missing
Have
Girl.
Always Lived in the Castle, which
Mm.
I loved, and maybe
Mm.
we should do that at some
Ooh.
stage. I mean, I don't. We haven't done one that one of us has read and one of us hasn't, but
Mm. Yeah.
it is
I feel
wonderful.
this. Sylvie says, "It
Um,
mostly took me so long to read because my brain is soup." I feel that. Yeah, it was so annoying because it's such a short book as well, and I was really thinking like, "Oh, this is gonna be so atmospheric. I'll just sit
yeah,
down and I'll read it really, like, in one sitting. I'll just sit with it and let it percolate." But I really, like, I couldn't read it like that. I
yeah.
had to have a break.
I feel like all her books I think are quite short,
Mm,
but like they're all around like 200 pages.
mm,
But like, I mean, this and We Have Always Lived in the Castle, and even her short stories like The Lottery and The Missing Girl, and
mm.
they all create such a vivid kind of world in them that it does feel like you're there for quite a long time,
Yeah.
and that it's you know so it's I mean it's a lot of talent to be able to do that, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, because like a lot of it is so internal. And it's weird, like you reading it, you kind of almost imagine that it's from Natalie's point of view, which it is, but it's not actually in first person.
Yeah,
Does a really good job of having this sort of, third person narration that like doesn't feel distant at all. We feel so in
yeah,
tune with Natalie. But then also she's kept at a distance from us as well. And it's a very unique skill. Because I actually
yeah,
don't know, like people often on like booktube or whatever, like people on bookish social media doing like polls and stuff, be like, oh, do you prefer like first person or third? And often I can never actually remember after I finished a book
yeah,
whether it was in first or third. Because I
yeah.
guess like a good person doing like a good author doing a third person narration, like you still know what the characters are thinking. Um,
Mm.
but yeah, I mean, I found that really, yeah, just her way of like putting you inside this person's head was just quite, yeah, uncanny, really.
Yeah.
Mm. Um, so yeah, I guess with that all being said, I think that wraps up our Hangsaman discussion, and we can look forward to our next book, our next
Yeah,
month.
which I don't have to like. I don't have
Me
it yet.
neither.
So.
So here it is. Here is the grand reveal, and as you can probably tell by the sort of subject matter of this one, it was supposed to be our October book. So Hangsaman was our September book because it was like academia, set at a university, and September is the month where
At
universities
the
start.
time that
And then this was supposed to be October because this one is a YA novel that comes highly recommended.
our
Um,
first YA novel, I
our
think.
first YA, but about witches and tarot and a girl who goes missing. So it's sort of obviously like eerie, similar, but it's more witchy, different tone because
I
it's
think
YA.
it is girls' school as well.
Yeah, it is a girls' school. I mean, that's sort of like we could have had a whole book club just around girls' school narratives. We've done quite a few. I mean, Plain Bad Heroines and this and Cat's Eye and yeah. So yeah, this will just have to be like November, but October 2.0 in a way because I didn't actually read any spooky books during October, so I feel like I need to make up for it anyway. And we will be aiming to do the live show for this book during the first week of December. So we still have a few weeks, but yeah, 3-4 weeks to read it. And we hope that you join us again. I'm mainly just talking to Sylvie, to be honest, because Sylvie's the only one who read Hangsaman. And she's going to order it soon, so we can all read it together, and I'm very excited. This is definitely one that, like, I think a lot of the books we've read have been quite not academic, but like we've read Atwood and Sorry Jackson, like books that we can pick apart for hours. Whereas I'm quite excited for this one that's a bit more of a fun one, and maybe like we'll still have stuff to talk about, but it's just maybe not going to be as like heavy in terms of like emotional content as some of the other ones. But I'm very excited.
Yeah, I did read the first few pages in the bookstore, and I thought it was looked really good. So
Yeah.
I'm very excited.
I'm excited. Well, I have to order it as well, but luckily I got a voucher for my birthday, so I can order it like without having the guilt of buying books straight after my birthday. Because I can be like, it's a voucher, it's part of it.
Very true.
And Sophie says not to suggest that YA can't be complex, but with my soup brain, I appreciate this. Literally same. Like, I feel like after Hangsaman, I do just need like a sort of head empty, no thoughts book. Not that this will have no thoughts, but just like a book for the vibes,
It will be like a lot of fun.
Yeah, definitely. Maybe we could like watch The Craft or something between like now and the discussion.
Have you seen the new adaptation?
No, is it good? I thought it looked shit.
To be honest, I've watched it really recently, and I can hardly remember it. But it was not very good. But some parts were quite. The kind of beginning I thought was all right, and then it kind of slowly got terrible.
Oh, okay.
But it's got that guy, doesn't it have? I think it has that guy from Heathers in it.
Hmm?
You know, the guy
Christian
from
Slater.
Heathers. I think so.
Oh my god. Why am I so shook? Christian Slater. I do love Heathers.
Him?
Are you making this up?
I might be.
Oh wow.
No, I think it's someone else.
Oh my god, B.
I was like, oh no, it's not Christian Slater. It's the guy from X-Files.
That is so different. That is not the same at all.
It does look kind of similar. Like, yeah.
That's so embarrassing.
He is in the film. Yeah.
Is that a selling point though? Do we like him?
I mean, he's fine. I quite like some X-Files, but yeah.
Well, I'm gonna stop sharing
I'm
this
so-
because I
I'm
realised that we didn't need it on.
I'm sorry I got them mixed up, Anna.
That's okay. You just missold it to me, but that's fine. I will. I'll watch it. I'll watch anything. Sure. Right. I'm so glad that your voice survived as well. I
Yeah.
was worried about it a bit in the middle, and also that the Wi-Fi sort of came back to us in the end. So yeah, have we reached the natural end?
Yes.
I never quite know because I never want it to be abrupt, but I also like don't want to just waffle about nothing for like 5 minutes because people have stuff to do with their evenings. So yeah, that is our discussion for Hangsaman over and done with. I think it's definitely one that will linger for a while though, so I'm very excited to see how it like percolates in the brain. And yeah, as we said, next month we will be reading, or this month we will be reading, All Our Hidden Gifts by Caroline O'Donoghue, and I'll post it again on our Twitter account. And we're hoping to do the live show during the first week of December. And our Twitter is where you will find all of the up to date information on what's happening. Yeah, we will do our very best to be on time as we always do. Thank you so much for
Thank
coming
you.
and thank you for reading it because I know it was a hard one and I empathize with Soup Brain. So thank you very much for reading it. Very much enjoyed hearing your thoughts. I mean, reading your thoughts, hearing, and yeah, very much looking forward to getting like witchy vibes in the next one. So yeah. Peace out, and we'll see you next month, hopefully.
Bye.
Bye.